Morning, everybody, and thank you for the invitation to speak today. Kim had asked me, as David said, to share my thoughts on what cheating meant to me when I was an athlete. I had to rack my brains and remember. And as a sports administrator, both inside and outside of racing. So I'm going to try and cover a bit of personal perspective and also a little bit about the BHA and what we do. And I know I've got Brant watching me, so if I get it wrong, I'm sure he'll wave at me. So what does cheating mean as an athlete? What are we doing in racing? And, of course, what we can learn from other sports, and are we doing enough? I put this on just to remind me that I was once an athlete. I believe there are some really key common components that define sport. One of the most special, of course, is that the result of a sports match or game or race is unpredictable. The outcomes have to be unknown. And as an athlete or a coach, you have to believe you've got a chance of winning. And not just those people participating, but whether you're a fan or a punter, you've got to know that it's worth a shot at that outsider. It's also really important because it's what makes live sports events some of the top viewed television programs across the globe. And it's why sport can command such high media fees for them. I think the one thing that I wanted to know when I was in that lightweight four, I wanted to look across that start line at my opponents and know that I had a chance of beating them. That not only had I done everything I could to be in the right place, mentally, physically, and technically, I also wanted to know that nobody else in those other crews and on that start line had benefited in any way, whether through taking illegal substances, either in training or to help them make weight that morning. I wanted to know that their boat was on weight, that it met the regulatory requirements, and that they had no advantage that I hadn't been able to take either. Not least of which, and I hadn't really appreciated it till I got to Atlanta, but in the Olympic Games, we were also all sex tested. So the first thing that happens when you arrive at the village is you'll queue up, well, it certainly did in those days, and have a swab taken to make sure you had the right chromosomes. And thankfully, my crew all passed, so that was all right. And of course, like any team or athlete, I and my crew and my coach played with gamesmanship. We did whatever we could to get advantage, whether that was sort of looking the part so that we were confident, trying to psych out our opponents. And we pushed the rules right to the limit where we could. We would get to the start as late as possible. We would be the last crew to declare we were straight. We were really happy to test those unwritten rules. Not quite like Lance Armstrong, but we all do it. We all push things to the limit where we can. I guess my point is that even in a sport where there was no money, where the glory of winning is about all there is, there are still reasons to cheat. And people will always find ways to get around the system to gain advantage. In its broadest sense, sport has evolved very, very rapidly in those last 3 decades since I was an athlete. Even small amateur sports like mine, like rowing, have seen the professionalisation in coaching and administration at club and national level, as well as international. And as the investment into sport rises, the public's expectations of how they engage with sport also rises. And with it, the scrutiny of sport, and in particular, the scrutiny of integrity. It's something that the media, probably more than our law enforcement bodies, are interested in pursuing, at least to start with. In the past, sport has had a privileged, autonomous existence, but that may not always be the case. And whilst the power of sport has not diminished, it has become common to hear stories of scandals, accusations and damning testimonies that undermine the integrity of sport. And one of the things I did, one of the last things I did as chair of British Rowing was I chaired an independent review into British cycling after allegations that were exposed in the media about bullying, which went much deeper. So the sport of racing is not unique in being a sport that's also a leisure pursuit. It's also a way of life that brings generations together. It's I think racing is more of a movement. It crosses national borders, importantly, crosses socio-economic groupings. There's amateur and professional structures that feed into it. But it is a vast, multinational entertainment business. And this alone makes it vulnerable to exploitation and to corruption. Where money is involved, especially where money is involved, there will always be somebody looking to take advantage. But as we've heard this morning already, we often worry about the profile of cheating in racing and integrity. I don't believe that it's any worse than any other sports, whether that's professional or amateur. In racing, there's always been an additional threat as well. And whilst betting in sport dates way back, there are some people that have suggested that betting in sport was actually taking place with the ancient Greeks. Horse racing, as we know, has been reliant on betting and wagering since way before the first Derby in 1780. It's a sport that is perhaps the most intrinsically linked to betting. Our rules are explicitly aimed at protecting punters and the sport as a betting product. For me, that does occasionally make for some interesting decisions if you come at it from an athlete's perspective. So, as we know, racing has always had a greater threat of people either inside or outside trying to manipulate the outcome for their gain. To be fair, racing has always accepted it. It's dealt with it. And our approach at the BHA has evolved knowing this. In 2002, a UK TV documentary alleged that racing in Britain was institutionally corrupt and it was unable to tackle betting-related corruption. After a 6-month in-depth review, the allegation was refuted, but it was quite clear that there were a number of individuals who were prepared to pay large sums of money to corrupt and subvert trainers and jockeys. A huge amount of resource was diverted to address the problem. And by 2008, a further review concluded that the approach taken by racing was now a model for effective investigation of corruption in sport. It endorsed the approach taken by the BHA, BHB since 2003. So I think we don't rest on our laurels in this sport. We've had betting and we've had integrity issues for a long time. More recently, the Quinlan Review addressed the independence of our judicial panels at the BHA and made recommendations to increase independence. And although this is widely viewed as a world leader, we have some teething problems and some questions to answer. But overall, I think we are definitely leading, certainly in the betting way. Promoting and upholding integrity is a key function of all sport governing bodies. They were set up to write the rules of the game, and they made sure to make sure they were followed. But today, how we do this is not straightforward, as Brett has alluded to. Instead of just policing those who've broken the rules of the game on the field of play, we now need to understand how integrity works and how cheating and corruption occurs. Sport integrity is an academic subject in its own right. And I really do believe there's much we can learn about the approach to corruption from a theoretical viewpoint to build a picture of how best to tackle it. And Jack's alluded to that this morning. At the BHA, we believe it's our role to create an environment where the industry as a whole works together to prevent corruption. And this will help deter the small number who may be susceptible to corruption in our sport, who are also, as we know, often the most vulnerable. It's not straightforward. Sort of situational offenders, as they can be called sometimes. And this will also help catch and punish those who do attempt and manage to corrupt our sport. We do need to help educate those, particularly those who are most vulnerable, to distinguish what is right and wrong and to be proactive about encouraging reporting and making it as easy as possible for people to speak up when they think that things don't look right. There's always an easy test. If it doesn't smell right, it probably isn't right. It's blindingly obvious that corruption and cheating doesn't happen in isolation. And we know this from other sectors, and we've already talked about turning a blind eye and accepting standards this morning. The tone and culture is set right at the top of each and every organisation. Consider the depths of drug taking and cheating in athletics that were revealed over the last few years, and then look at the leadership of the then IAAF, World Athletics now, at the time. Lemane Diack, the president of the IF, who Brett mentioned, was taking payments to cover up positive samples. If we look at match fixing in football in the 2000 teens, and then consider the leadership of FIFA at the time and the style of Sepp Blatter, who was transferring millions of dollars to friends and colleagues with no explanation. From those of you who are here from Ireland will no doubt remember scandals around Patrick Hickey at Rio, and more recently the FAI loan scandal. Every nation will have a story in sport. As leaders in racing, it's up to us to set the tone, to be seen to be fair and honest, and to be seen to be doing the right thing. Running our organisations with integrity and transparency, and taking the risk of corruption very seriously. We can't rest on our laurels. Sport betting and related illegal practices, such as money laundering, drug dealing, and people trafficking, have all been associated with corruption in sports across the globe. None of these are national matters that can be dealt with by an organisation like the BHA alone, or by those in British sport. Across the Olympic movement, and largely in response to high-profile leadership scandals, the international sports federations, as we've seen in athletics, are setting up their completely independent global integrity units. We're a long way, I think, in racing from being able to tackle global corruption and to deter criminal activity in this way. But there are really good examples of jurisdictions working together to try and tackle it. Any sort of global response for racing would be a huge step, not least requiring the harmonisation of rules and sanctions, and something that other sports, even through WADA, have really struggled to do. In order to safeguard integrity in sport, we need a multi-layered approach, and one that's everybody's responsibility, because integrity doesn't sit in isolation. In some ways it does in High Holborn, we have it all on one floor, but integrity has to run through each and every department and every decision in every organisation, and that is the only way that we'll build trust. For us at the BHA, the relationship between the regulator and our stakeholders, I will admit, is fragile, but it is vital. The regulator, I don't think, should ever be so close to its stakeholders that it can't question its practices. And our stakeholders and our members should see this as a strength. It's not easy to question and review those who you know, and it can be really difficult and unpopular. We have a number of key integrity pillars that work at several levels, and these mirror the sorts of things that Brett were just talking about, from our centralised intelligence unit, which is based on the national intelligence model, all the way down to individuals, stable visitors, equine welfare investigators, and an anti-doping function that's very much at the coalface. We've long established bet monitoring systems, and we've built up really good relationship with the betting industry, with regular information sharing, including our case reviews. Not only is betting an integral part of racing, but there's also a huge reliance on it financially, both in the UK and many other countries. But it is a rapidly changing environment, and we have to keep evolving the way that we look at this, whether it's the impact of opening up of sports betting in the US, whether it's the move to more online betting and the accessibility of overseas racing. All these things add to complexity. It takes up a huge amount of resource, but it's obviously something that's quite key and important to us. And we work across many national organisations and many government bodies to help protect racing and the future of racing. In many ways, it's incredible that there is this reliance, and yet we still have such autonomy. I suspect most of our jurisdictions have some relationship and reliance on our governments, perhaps whether that's for direct or indirect funding. And in the UK at the moment now, not only do we need them to help facilitate funding, but we also need government to recognise the value our sport brings to individuals and society. We need them to support us to mitigate the risk of corruption by addressing the risk of criminal interference that threatens the integrity and therefore the existence of racing. And in the UK, as well as elsewhere, there's the matter of social licence, the public's sort of ongoing approval and broad social acceptance of racing. We could risk losing the support or the neutrality of much of our community if we're perceived as corrupt and accepting of cheating, or if gambling and betting are perceived as so toxic. And whilst much relies on the ethical acceptance too of using animals in sport, we need to be aiming not just for acceptance and tolerance of our sport, but for public and political trust in our systems and in our organisations. Can we do better? Of course we can. We always have to keep doing better if we are to continually try and deter those who actively seek to corrupt racing. They will always be a step ahead. Our key principles at the BHA are first and foremost to act to prevent corruption in the first place, and when it does occur, as it will, to try and detect and sanction those we catch. It's a mixture of carrot and stick. Our evolving education programme is delivered through many channels to help participants recognise and report cheating and corrupt practices. That's the carrot. By normalising discussion, we can help people have the confidence to report or to speak out, and to help them refuse to take part if they're approached. And we're creating an operations unit to help us to act more quickly to translate intelligence into action if we need to, so that we can use the stick when we do. The fight against corruption requires coordination across many, many stakeholders and disciplines globally. We need to be upfront and open when we're engaging all of our partners in a coordinated and consistent way to fight corruption and criminal activity. We already work with football and tennis, who both have a lot of risk around betting. We have sophisticated systems for monitoring this, but we need to recognise that there are areas that we are behind and where we can learn from other sports, whether that's in our governance, whether it's in fit and proper person tests, whether that's in considering the vulnerability of some of our participants in a safeguarding way, and looking at bribes and tendering processes and in other ways. It's important that each of us as stakeholders and all of our organisations recognise the role and responsibility we have to the global community to protect the integrity of racing. The autonomy of our sport can only be retained if it's earned, and if the culture of good governance is embedded in every decision that we take. Thank you.